So welcome back everyone to our book study on how learning happens. It's wonderful to have everyone here, and a special welcome to anyone who's new, who didn't have a chance to attend the first session a couple of weeks ago. So super excited to have everyone here. Thank you for taking the time this Saturday morning to spend with us and talk about how learning happens. Okay, real quick, my name is Nidhi Sachdeva, and I'm a professor of education at the University of Toronto at Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, and I'm one of the co-presenters. And my co-presenter here is Jim Hewitt, who's also a professor at the University of Toronto, and the two of us teach and often co-teach courses on the science of learning for pre-service and graduate education programs. So exciting, really excited to be here and continue this journey with you all. Jim, please take the word.
Sure. Hi, folks. So the book we're studying is entitled How Learning Happens, Seminal Works in Educational Psychology and What They Mean in Practice. So if this is your first time here, this is an award-winning book. It's written by Paul Kirschner and Carl Hendrick. I find it to be a really terrific text, and we'll be examining selected chapters from this text over the span of the book series. So this is the book that Nidhi and I also use in our courses. Each chapter examines a seminal article from educational research that has important educational and practical implications for instruction. So it's a really great resource for any teacher, and we hope you like it.
Okay, so in our first session, we talked about the information processing model and cognitive load theory. This is our second session in this series, and today we'll be talking about prior knowledge and advanced organizers. But we're going to begin today with a quick review of last day's material or last session's material that we covered in session 1. And then after that, we want to look at prior knowledge and why prior knowledge plays such a pivotal role in the learning of new knowledge. So what we want to do is I'll just walk you through the agenda real quickly, and then we'll do that quick review session. So here's the agenda for today. We'll spend a little bit of time reactivating our memories from session 1, and then we'll go on to the content from session 2. So let's do a quick review of last week's session, or 2 weeks ago, I should say. To do this, we'll do a little retrieval practice activity. We're going to talk a bit more about retrieval practice in the coming weeks. It's actually one of the themes that we're going to cover. But retrieval practice is essentially about getting learners to pull information out of their brains without really having it in front of them. And it is a very, very effective, highly effective learning strategy. And retrieval practice can be done in so many different ways. The way we're going to do it today is just by means of a simple quiz. And the word quiz can be exciting for some and can be, stressful for others. But this is just a very, very zero stakes, nothing recorded anywhere kind of quiz. No one's really keeping track of who answered and who answered what. If you weren't here last time and if you don't remember much, don't worry. If you don't know the answer to something, take a guess. And again, it doesn't matter. It's really an opportunity to see what we know, and we're trying to pull that out of our brain to be able to recall and retain that better. So one of the purposes of the quiz is actually to activate prior knowledge of last time's material. So it's actually a perfect thing for us to do, aligning with the topic as well, and it gives us an opportunity to recap what we've also learned in this book series so far. Take a moment. There's about 6 questions. We'll spend a couple of minutes on it and give everybody a fair chance to try it, and then we'll look at the results. Okay. Any last guesses if folks want to do it? I'm just about to end the poll, and I'll show the results, and we'll quickly just go over it together. Is that good for everyone? Can I get some emojis? Okay, perfect. The folks whose cameras are on, I'm getting some emojis from them, so I'll take that. Thank you. And you, for those whose cameras are not on, can also drop an emoji in the chat for me. But we have a great participation here. It's like about 90+% folks have answered. So I'm going to end the poll, and I'm going to share the results, and we can just briefly talk about it. Can you all see the results? Perfect. Wonderful. So let's just really quickly go over these questions. So what are the 3 primary components of the information processing model? And many of you answered correctly. It is sensory working and long-term memory. I know short-term memory tends to be a more generic term that a lot of people use, but it's I think I could be wrong about the exact time, but around the 60s, the idea from short-term memory within the cognitive science was switched to working memory, because short-term memory it was seemed as it's just the information was staying there for a little bit, but working memory actually shows this idea that information is actually being worked on in that space. So that's why working memory aligns a much better word. And there's more to it, but just a really quick info why we use the word working memory in cognitive science. What are the characteristics of working memory? And most of you, and many of you actually, almost all of you have answered correctly. It has a very small capacity and it retains information for a short period of time. So one way to think about it is that it's limited capacity and time duration is also limited. So it's both ways. It's tiny and it just goes really, really, really fast. Cognitive load theory is most directly concerned with which type of memory. And again, the answer is correct. It is concerned with working memory because what cognitive load theory tells us, it's different kinds of load that puts that extra load on our working memory. And because the information doesn't pass through, it doesn't even have a fair chance to get into the long-term memory. So yes, it is. And that's why it's a really important theory for how instructions should be designed, because it really is tackling a very big challenge within the space of information processing model. Number 4 is, suppose a child is listening to an instructor's presentation on Zoom about the impact of social media on people's attention span. The corner of one of the presenter's PowerPoint slide contains a cute animation of a cat battling a ball of string down a set of stairs. Super cute. But in the context of the lesson, the animation is a form of what? What kind of load? It is extraneous cognitive load. It is not directly related to learning. It's cute and it does get students' attention, but it takes away the attention from the actual content that needs to be taught. So it really does enhances and increases the cognitive load and extraneous cognitive load on our working memory, and thereby pushes sort of learning away from what actually needs to be learned. So all these GIFs and animations, when they're not needed, they're really not needed in that moment. So there's a time and place for them, but not when you want students to focus on the actual content. The difference between novices and experts is that experts have much more knowledge than novices and solve problems differently than novices. That is correct. Experts have so many more schemas, mental frameworks in their brain, and they tap into that. And novices are what we often call it as means and analysis as well. They're like doing, maybe this will work, maybe this will work. And the effect of that is that it really ends up overloading their working memory. And that can lead to frustration, that can lead to being really behind in something. That's why the secret recipe sauce should be to have as many mental schemas which come from prior knowledge as possible, so we can shift away from that. And the last question is, some educational consultants propose that children should be given the opportunity to work like real mathematicians at a young age by putting them in charge of their learning experience and allowing them to invent and discover their own math, much like real mathematicians do. The research described in the first 2 chapters suggest that such approaches don't work well and may even be harmful. There's a lot of evidence now, and this is exactly what we're talking about, why sometimes letting students discover something on their own without them having the background knowledge can be quite detrimental for them. So letting them discover how the sounds work or how math equations work, and that can be very, very damaging for them. And then we talked about the disparity just continues to increase quite a bit. So great, thank you. Thanks everyone for participating in these questions. If there was any doubts about these, we'll definitely save some time towards the end and we can take it up. But awesome, this was our quick retrieval practice. I'm gonna share my screen again. Yes, share results here. I'll stop sharing 1 second. There we go. So I'll share my screen again and we'll go back to our slides. Thank you.
Hey, well, thank you everyone for doing the quiz. That was actually pretty good. That's, I think, better than the students in our courses do. Yeah, so let's do just a quick recap of the information processing model. This is what we looked at last week, and we actually use this particular screen as our advanced organizer. It's kind of the foundation for our courses. But the way it works, I'll just to go through what we talked about last week. But basically, when we process knowledge, we begin by receiving information through our senses, our eyes and our ears. It's primarily visual and auditory information. Oh, Nidhi, do you want to show the animation? Thank you. But before new knowledge can be stored into long-term memory, it's got to pass through working memory first. And as Nidhi was saying, our working memory has a very limited capacity. we can only hold 4 to 7 chunks in working memory at any one time. So in some sense, you can think of the working memory as the bottleneck. There are limits to the speeds at which students can take in new information and process it. And so the final step involves encoding the new knowledge in working memory that we have in working memory into our long-term memories. And we do this by connecting the new knowledge to knowledge that we already have. This kind of makes sense. We can only really understand the world in light of what we already know. So this is what we call learning, is when we make permanent changes to long-term memory. Now, last week, we focused all of our attention on working memory because that's the bottleneck. And we introduced this notion of cognitive load theory. So understanding the limitations of working memory is really important because if a learner's working memory becomes swamped with too much information all at once, it can interfere with their learning. And it can also be really frustrating. So from an educational perspective, one of the most important things that we have to do as teachers is ensure that students' working memories are not overloaded and that they can actually do the processing needed to make additions to their long-term memories. So this is the fundamental idea behind cognitive load theory. It's all about just not overwhelming a learner's working memory. Now, this week, what we want to do is shift our attention a bit. Instead of looking at working memory, we're going to focus on long-term memory. And we're going to look at the role that long-term memory plays in learning. So this is the topic that we've been focusing on this week through the readings, prior knowledge and advanced organizers. Now, Ozabel is the person who came up with the notion of advanced organizers. Ozabel says that prior knowledge is the most important single factor influencing learning. If you can figure out what the learner already knows and teach them accordingly, you're more likely to be effective. It's a really interesting statement, and it's important to understand why Ozabel says this. The claim is backed up by an awful lot of research. I was actually really surprised when one of my instructors told me this, that prior knowledge was probably the top predictor of learning, knowing what the learner already knows. In fact, it's a better predictor of future learning than just about anything else. So fundamentally, people learn new things by connecting new knowledge to relevant existing knowledge. So let me show you an example of two learners, student A and student B. There we go. You'll notice that student B has prior knowledge that student A lacks. So this is a problem for educators. Student B will be able to create links between new knowledge and this existing knowledge, and student A won't be able to do that. So let's assume an instructor teaches a new lesson, and that new lesson connects well to student B's prior knowledge. But for student A doesn't have anything to connect that to. So student B was able to create these links and associate the new knowledge to the prior knowledge, but student A doesn't have that prior knowledge, so the links can't be created. Student A might retain a little bit of knowledge from this lesson, but not as much as student B. Now, a key point I want to make here is that this is how a rich get richer dynamic can occur in education, because student B learned more from this lesson than student A. But what's important to understand here is that the advantage that student B has just might keep growing over time, because all the new learning that student B did, these 3 green squares, that can now be used as prior knowledge for the next lesson, making it possible for student B to create even more links, whereas student A will fall further and further behind over time. So this is what some educators refer to as a Matthew effect, or a rich get richer effect, where some students race ahead of other students because they have prior knowledge that other students lack. And because knowledge builds on knowledge, you can develop this kind of cycle of advantage where student B gets further and further ahead of student A. So this notion that Ausubel was referring to of prior knowledge being so critical, it's kind of grounded in this notion. Everything depends upon the student having the proper prior knowledge hooks for the new knowledge. So in this case, student B had the hooks, so student B was able to learn. Student A didn't have the hooks, and so student A learned relatively little from the lesson, and the stuff they did learn was disconnected and will likely just be forgotten over time. Now, I don't know about you, but most of us have probably been in the position of student A. You might think back to maybe a lecture that you've attended where the content was over your head. I've been at I've been at a number of these kinds of lectures in university, and I'll be in those lectures and I'll be listening carefully to every word, and I'm trying really hard to understand what the speaker is saying, but I can't do it. And it's not about effort. It's not about, it's not about desire. I want to understand this, but I can't understand it because I can't hook it into things that I already know. Now, there might be others in the audience who are more like student B, and they think the lecture is terrific because they have all the hooks, so they get what the lecturer is saying. But I'm in the student A position, and I'm just lost. I just feel like all the knowledge has just gone over my head. So this is why we as teachers have to worry about student prior knowledge. Okay, so let's go back to the beginning and look at this original situation again. So here's how student A and B started. Now, if we want to correct this problem that we have with student A, not being able to create those connections, the first thing we need to do is to check to see if students have the prior knowledge necessary for learning the new content. So in this case, we would, for example, want to be able to detect that student A has missing prior knowledge. So maybe, Nidhi, maybe you could lead us through an activity. We want to maybe talk about some of the different ways we could do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Jim. So yeah, at this point, as Jim was saying in the slide before over here that I had, I'll go back to it for 1 second here. This idea of detect the missing prior knowledge, we thought it would be an amazing opportunity for us to do a real quick brainstorm session. And I have a Padlet activity for which I'm going to share the link with you all in 1 second in the chat. And the Padlet is a really fun platform. Folks might have already worked with it. It may be new for some folks, so I'll just briefly talk about it. It's a really fun way to collaboratively share your ideas, and it's all shows up here, so you can still see my screen here. What you'll do is, if you click on the link that I sent you in the chat, what you'll be able to see this question which says, what are some of the ways we as teachers can employ to check for students' prior knowledge? I can see some folks have started joining in here. To submit a sort of idea, you would say, click on this particular plus button here, and then it opens it up to like this tiny little window, and you can say, do easy quizzes with no stakes. So that could be one way for us to check for students' prior knowledge. And then you just publish it and everybody's responses start showing up here. So we just thought it would be a nice way to just see what some of the creative ideas and simple ideas as well that we as educators have. And what we're trying to do is detect the missing prior knowledge, because that's a very integral step in moving along. So take a moment, and again, it's not mandatory that you share something here, but it's just nice if you do. You might be doing something really fun. Yeah, and something simple as have a conversation, for example. So thank you. Yeah, KW chart. So it's all on the screen. Everybody can have a look at it as well. Yeah, quick question, thumbs up or down. I love working with emojis when I'm teaching on Zoom, for example. Simple, but really effective. And in different groups, different cohorts, different kinds of activities work better. So It's always nice to have a little collection of all these, and we'll share this link to this Padlet with everyone at the end. MJ is probably going to share all that content. Journal entries, quizzes, writing activity, use a tool like Plickers, play a game, pictures, quick knowledge check. Okay. Scale check, yeah. Placement exercise, 30-second table discussion. Jim, anything jumping to you that you'd like to mention?
No, other than, these are very good. Yeah, it can be a really difficult task because sometimes a lot of students will have prior knowledge, but a few may not, and it could be because of cultural reasons. It could be because of a whole bunch of reasons, language reasons, if they're ESL learners, all sorts of things.
Yeah. And it can be nerve-wracking for some of the students to do that in a classroom where everybody is seeming to show that they know it. So there are probably also good ideas to do it in a subtle way where it doesn't become obvious that, let's say Jim has a lot more prior knowledge, we're in the same class and I don't. And so I think there are some more subtle ways to do that as well. So thinking about all these things really helps because the intent is really important. The intent is very positive for us as educators, but we don't want to shut our students out as well. Great technology. Yeah, I mean, I think that's the other really great benefit with some of these technological tools like Mentimeter, and then somebody shared Plickr. So thank you for that. And you could do that in an anonymous way if the teacher is just trying to get an idea. And if you want to get a specific idea who has it, who doesn't, and then you may want to have like a more focused intervention for that. But if it's a general and you have a sense that, oh, a lot. So for example, when we did the quiz, and if many got wrong, that tells us something. But a majority actually got it right. So, but Jim still did like a real quick recap of what cognitive load theory is and information processing model and stuff. Kate's asking, what is Blooket? Does anybody want to mention whoever wrote it? My daughter does it. It's actually kind of like a really fun kind of game she plays, and there's all these list of questions in there, and you can play that with another person on a different device, and it throws kind of like multiple choice questions at you. Her recent fascination is with rocks and minerals. She's been asking me lots of questions, so we play Blooket. It's kind of like a online portal of lots of questions. Yeah, it's actually fun. And she creates her own as well, which gives her a lot of satisfaction when she makes her own questions. But sometimes they can just use an existing sort of group of questions. So yeah, kids really like it. At least I've noticed with the grade 4. Okay, thank you. Reviewing using an example, I like that a lot actually, because that kind of like goes to everybody. Sometimes I say doing a recap doesn't hurt anyone, but it ends up benefiting some that really could use it. So thank you. Okay, so we can continue moving along. Thanks, folks, and you can keep adding later on as well. And again, this Padlet stays active, but I'll take us all back to the slides. Thank you. Oh, that didn't work. Oh, it did work. All right, there we go.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, terrific ideas here. Paul asked a really good question in the chat too that I want to kind of get to here as well. Paul asked if there's a difference between activating prior knowledge and let me just see here what he said. Activating prior knowledge and checking prior knowledge. And yeah, they're two really different things. That's a really good point. So in this case, we were checking prior knowledge and we determined there was a gap for student A in terms of their prior knowledge. So, so that's a problem. And once we detect that gap, we have to fill that gap. We have to provide that students with the prior knowledge. So when we teach the lesson, they'll have the hooks to actually make sense of what the new lesson is all about. So that's kind of detecting a gap in prior knowledge and then filling it. After that, we have to activate prior knowledge. That's a little bit different. And that basically means we have to say to the students, can you go back one slide there, Nidhi?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Sure.
Was it this one?
No, forward. Let's see. One more?
It was this one.
That one, yeah. We basically have to say, now that students have the prior knowledge, we also want to say to students, okay, this is the particular prior knowledge that you should be thinking about in this lesson. We want to highlight the prior knowledge that is relevant, that has the hooks for the new content. And that's the activation step. We tell them which prior knowledge is relevant and which prior knowledge they should hook the new knowledge to. Then we can go about teaching the lesson, and hopefully all students will benefit. So basically, this puts all students in a good position to learn because they all have the necessary prior knowledge and they know what to hook the new knowledge to. Okay, thanks, Paul, for raising that. That's a really good point. Are there any questions or comments?
Yeah, I think I'm just going to go back to this slide for 1 second, just mention what Jim just said, that this puts every student in a good position. That, I think, is a very important thought to consider. There's a whole notion of equity in there. You've identified what the gap is as an educator, and it's by no means, I wish it was as easy as just drawing these or even using the figure from as simple as getting these 3 squares. It is not. Of course, it's a lot more complicated, but I think just getting this idea that detecting it and then telling them that this is what you need, and then teaching the new knowledge, we're just trying to actually be a little bit more sort of casting that net a little bit more wider that way, and making sure that everybody hopefully will benefit in as similar of ways as possible with this new knowledge that's about to just enter their long-term memory, provided that we've also followed the cognitive load theory. So I just wanted to mention that here. Any questions or comments at this point before we move to the next piece? Just looking at some of the things here. Matthias is saying, I think it's important to make them retrieve for being sure if they remember the content, not just activate. Yes, because activated could mean you'd be summarizing of the previous lesson. Yes, so absolutely, the retrieval practice component, sort of that deep processing, and as well as recall, that's a very important part as well, because it just makes knowledge more accessible in the long run. We will be covering that as well. But any other important thoughts or comments, questions that might be coming up? I don't know if I've missed anything in the chat. Accumulated advantage and disadvantage. Yes, that's exactly right. The Matthew effect. I think Anustup had mentioned that earlier as well. Okay, so again, more thoughts can keep coming, and please continue sharing in the chat as well. Now we want to tell you about a classic research paper that illustrates the importance of prior knowledge. And some of you have already heard of it. And again, it won't hurt to go through it again. I think it's quite an exciting research. It's called the baseball study. So I'm going to walk you through that particular study really briefly. So the baseball study by Rest and Leslie from 1988 does a really great job of illustrating the central role played by prior knowledge in learning. And so we want to share with you, and we think it's a really, really important study to have an understanding of. We're going to explain what the baseball study was and how the researchers set it up. But we're not going to give you the results right away. We're not going to tell you what actually they found. Instead, we're going to go and do another Zoom poll and to see if you folks can guess what the results of the study would have been. So let's first understand what the study was. So here goes. 2 researchers, Rest and Leslie, 1988, ran an experiment with a large number of students of middle schools, a large number of middle school students. First of all, they assessed the reading ability of these students, and they were assessed as having high or low reading ability. Okay, so some of these students were familiar with so reading high and reading low. Now, some of these students that are in the high reading ability and the low reading ability were familiar with the game of baseball, and some were not. So the 2 groups of students that are here, high and low reading ability, general reading ability, were then subdivided into 4 groups, like so. Okay, so you can see we have the high reading ability, and so the 4 groups were high reading ability, and they also had high baseball knowledge. Then we had high reading ability, but they had low baseball knowledge. I definitely will fall into that category when I was younger. Maybe not, I'm not sure. And then there's low reading ability and high baseball knowledge, and there's low reading ability, low baseball knowledge. So these were the 4 subgroups that were created out of the 2 initial groups. What happened then? The next step was to ask all the students to read a story about a baseball game. And let me give you a sample of the text, but just understand again, high reading ability, high knowledge of baseball, high reading, low knowledge. So again, these low with high knowledge of baseball. And this is the kind of a sample text that they read. So just trying to get my mouse to work here. Sometimes it messes up. Here we go. So Cherniak swings and hits a slow bouncing ball toward the shortstop. Haley comes in, fields it, and throws it to first, but too late. Cherniak is on first with a single. Johnson stayed on third. The next batter is Whitcomb, the Coors left fielder. I really have no idea what that means. If this was cricket, I probably would understand a little bit better. But yeah, that was the sample text, right? So the kids would read the text. They were given a wooden baseball field model with little baseball figures on it, so they could use to keep track of what was going on. So they were doing all of that fun stuff like that. Something like that, right? And they did this, and then afterward, the students were tested on what they had read, right? So they read the text, they had these figures to play around and track the content, and then they were tested on what they had read. The researchers wanted to know how well do they now understand the story, or how well did the students understood the story, okay? Pretty fair question. So let's stop here, and I'm going to ask you, here are the 4 groups again, and we have 2 questions in the poll that I'm going to release in a second. I want you to consider these 2 questions, and don't worry, it's in the poll, so you don't have to memorize it. Which of the 4 groups do you think scored the highest on reading comprehension? And which of the 4 groups do you think scored the second highest on the reading comprehension? Okay, perfect. I think the folks who haven't answered is probably just me and Jim now. Okay, here's the poll, and I'll share the results. So this is what you have said. First was high reading ability and high baseball knowledge, and most of you have said second was low reading ability and high baseball knowledge. So let's see what happens. So I have to share my screen again for that, and I'll take us all back to the slides. Okay, let's see what happened. Yeah, you've made the right guess. Let's hear the results of the comprehension test in the actual study, and we can look at these numbers on the bar chart as well in a second. But 87% high reading, high baseball, and the second was low reading ability, but high baseball knowledge, which was 81%. And you all guessed it right as well. Okay, that's great. So here's the bar chart for this, right? So it turns out that the students that scored highest on comprehension were the ones who were good readers and knew a lot about baseball. And this wasn't a surprise. The more surprising thing was the second scoring group, were students who were poor readers generally, but knew a lot about baseball. And they almost scored as high as the first group. And they outperformed the students who were actually good readers, but didn't know much about baseball by a huge lot. That group only got 52%, and the other group who had low reading abilities but high baseball knowledge got 81%, right? Now, this was fascinating as a result, and it's been duplicated many times in other studies. And I think that was a bit of the chat that was going on in there as well. And it shows the tremendous power of prior knowledge. I see this with my son a lot. He's an early reader. He's in SK, and he's starting to read decent amount of stuff, but sometimes when it's a big word, he feels like, there's something, then he has to pause. Or yesterday he was having a lot of trouble reading coleslaw because he doesn't really like it, and it's not a word that actually makes any sense to him. But you put him in front of while watching a Formula One race, and he reads all these big names like Verstappen and Hamilton. No problem. I've never taught him that, but he has so much knowledge of that just he sees the word and it just makes a lot of sense to him. And sometimes my 9-year-old, who's obviously a much advanced reader but does not have the same love for Formula One races, would be like, how does he know that, Mama? What happened in the race? And then that's another little experiment that happens in my own home of power of background knowledge, the tremendous power. So the students who knew about baseball were better positioned, going back to the study, to figure out what was happening in the story, even though they are assessed as being poor readers. It's also interesting that high ability readers who didn't know much about baseball struggled, and that's because they didn't have the hooks in long-term memory, right? One of the side effects of this research is that it revealed that a student's performance on tests of reading comprehension isn't just about the student's ability to decode text or their skill as a reader. It's also about prior knowledge, right? And because in this experiment, students' prior knowledge had a much bigger impact on their reading comprehension than whether they were a good reader or not. So I think it's just a really fascinating study. So pretty cool. And you can see that the high reading ability and high baseball knowledge group was first, followed by the low reading ability and high baseball knowledge group. And again, the reason this particular study became so famous because it demonstrated just how important background knowledge or prior knowledge is to reading comprehension. The students who knew the baseball were better positioned to figure out what's happening, and the ones who didn't were not able to do that, even though they were better readers. The findings of this study, I would say, are particularly important for second language students or students from lower socioeconomic status or for students from different cultures who may lack the vocabulary or cultural references or certain types of world knowledge, right? And that automatically then puts them at a disadvantage, right? So if we're interested in building a more equitable and inclusive education system, then students' prior knowledge has to be a big part of it. So it's very important that we consider that. Okay, Jim, take it on.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, so we thought we'd provide you with a couple of case studies that have to do with prior knowledge. We chose a couple of case studies from a book that Nidhi and I have read called How Learning Works. It's a terrific book. You might want to check it out if you haven't already got it or if you haven't looked at it. And it touches on a lot of the same principles as how learning happens. So we've got two different cases. One case is a situation in which a professor kind of polled students on whether they knew something, and the students thought they knew something, but turns out they didn't. And the second one was another one where, again, prior knowledge comes into play and is making it difficult for students to understand something. So what we're going to do is, I think we'll put in the chat maybe a link to this, to these two, a page showing you these two cases. And I think it's
already
hitting
put
that.
that in the chat.
MJ's got it?
Yeah.
Yeah, terrific. Thank you. And maybe put you into groups and maybe groups of 4 or 5, MJ, and see what you can come up with. What do you think went wrong in these cases? What was the problem with prior knowledge? It's a little bit tricky, but see what you think were the problems. So you want to go ahead and do that? We'll just spend maybe 5 minutes. Okay, so thank you. Sorry, folks. I think we brought you back maybe a little early because we realized we were getting a little close to 11 o'clock or the hour. So, but we thought we'd find out what you've discovered so far. So what were your thoughts about case one? What do you think went wrong in this particular case, and why did students have difficulty, or why did the teacher have difficulty teaching the statistics? If you have any thoughts, maybe just put up your hand or add a message to the chat. So didn't activate prior knowledge. Surface knowledge is not the same as deep knowledge. Fallacy of explanatory depth. That's nice. Labeling a test is not sufficient to. Case one, teacher question, superficial. Yeah, just because they were taught it doesn't mean they would know it. Knowing what a stats test is very difficult from knowing how to choose the right one. Yeah, actually, that resonates with me as a former math person. Is I knew about a lot of stats tests, but I could never figure out which one to apply to a particular situation. So let's here's one for case two, which is terrific. Let's yeah, case one, I think you guys are on top of it. Well, one problem is students don't always know what they know and what they don't know for case one. So the students can recognize the names of stats tests that are familiar to them, but that's, as you have said, this is not the same thing as knowing when to apply a particular test. It's not having that kind of deep understanding. So the students were essentially lacking that that more extensive prior knowledge. The instructor could probably have acquired a better sense of their prior knowledge if he or she had given them a small test at the beginning of the year. That probably, like it may be a very, no risk, low stress test. Which stats test would you apply in this particular situation? So recognizing that something is for students, that's easier than knowing how to apply it and when to apply it. Now, in case number 2, you guys have come up with a number of ideas. Curse of knowledge. Yes, right.
There's
I love that. Teacher may not have provided why negative enforcement really means. Reinforcement is a feedback loop. Need to undo incorrect popular conception. Yeah. So yeah, this is, as you guys are saying here, this is a terrific example of a situation in which their prior knowledge was actually interfering with their learning. Their everyday knowledge of the words punishment and negative were interfering with their efforts to understand the difference between these two concepts. So this is a situation not of students missing prior knowledge, but of students having prior knowledge that was interfering with their understanding of new material. So yes, thank you very much, folks. That's a really kind of good analysis of these two situations. It can be really tough. It can be really tough to figure out what's going on and why students struggle with these kinds of things. Let's go into the next slide, Nidhi. I think we've got, yeah. So these are some of the different ways that prior knowledge can help or hinder learning. It can help, or it's actually necessary in situations. You need to have your prior knowledge fairly accurate. There has to be enough of it. It has to be activated, as some people have talked about. And, it has to be appropriate for the situation and the context. But it can hinder prior knowledge if you don't have it, or if it's not activated, or if it's the wrong prior knowledge. So it has both these dimensions to it. And again, as teachers, we have to try to make sure students have the correct prior knowledge in the correct situation and make sure it's activated for students. Okay, so let's just do a quick summary of some of the main points from the chapters that you've read, from the work you've looked at. One is, if students lack prior knowledge, they're going to run into problems. So there might be terminology. There's a lot of equity implications here because there can be cultural implications. There can be language implications. So if students lack prior knowledge that you expect them to have, those students are going to be at a disadvantage. So, so we want to make sure students have the correct prior knowledge. We want to make sure it's activated before the learning occurs. There are multiple ways to activate prior knowledge, and you've given us a great list of them. We also have to be aware of times when students have incorrect or incomplete prior knowledge, because that can interfere with proper learning as well. We also gave you, as kind of an illustration, our information processing model slide, which can serve as an advanced organizer. You can use those to provide students with a structure to help them cognitively organize the new knowledge you plan to teach. And advanced organizers also serve in many ways to activate prior knowledge at the same time. The last thing we want to talk about that we feel is really important is just the recognition that knowledge is important. Sometimes you see people saying stuff like, knowledge is no longer important in the information age because students can look things up. So the argument goes, you don't need to teach knowledge because students have Google. And instead of teaching knowledge, we should be teaching students learning strategies or higher level skills. And that's not quite true, because we do need prior knowledge to learn new things. And to do any kind of critical thinking, you need to have a pretty foundation of knowledge in that subject that you're trying to do critical thinking on. If you don't have a basic knowledge of the field, you can't really judge whether statements are true or false or relevant or irrelevant. Knowledge is a really strong predictor of future learning. So we have to teach students facts and basic skills and other forms of knowledge. The whole argument about Google, about you can use Google to look things up. I think that's true if you're already somewhat an expert in the field. If you're an expert in teaching and you go to a teaching lecture and somebody uses a new word, you can Google that while you're listening, and that can help. But if you're like student A back there who lacks a lot of prior knowledge, Google's not going to help you in that situation. You really need that have that prior knowledge there. And so we can't really discount the value of students having the correct prior knowledge for lessons. Okay, so I think that brings us to the end of today's session. Nidhi, do you want to talk about next week?
Yes, absolutely. So next week, we're going to continue looking at the long-term memory, and we're going to look at and focus on depth of processing. And for that, there's the chapter 3, which is how deep is your processing. There's a video that you have a chance to watch as well. And also there's really great article by Daniel Willingham called Ask the Cognitive Scientist, Students Remember What They Think About. The Willingham reading is really, really good as well. And I think you all will enjoy it if you haven't read this before. And yeah, that's what we're going to focus on, the depth of processing, how to process the new knowledge so it is living in our long-term memory and process better in the long-term memory. That's what we're going to discuss. And yeah, we're excited for that. And any questions or comments are always welcome. We have some extra time because we've scheduled the sessions in a way that, we finish at 11, but we have around 10-ish or so minutes. So welcome to have a discussion, questions, comments. But other than that, I'll show you the last slide, which is have a great weekend. But I'll stop sharing and we'll stick around for if there's any thoughts, questions, comments, anything. And I see some hand raised as well. So that's great. Anna Marie, go ahead, please.
Hi, everybody. Just a quick question on your thoughts on to consolidate at the end of a lesson, asking students to comment or whatever, articulate their connection between where they started at the beginning of a lesson when their prior knowledge was activated with the now new knowledge that they have that is going to become prior knowledge. Do you see any value in spending? I think so, but I'd like your thoughts on, if I'm missing something, on the value of consolidating in that way. Thank you.
Yeah, so I certainly think so. I agree with you. I think it's great. And every time they consolidate it by either they do it orally or by writing it down, that actually further solidifies that new knowledge in their heads. So I think it's a terrific thing to do.
I recently just read it's so simple, but it's so powerful. It's called Two Things. It's one of the ritual practice activities. And you could do it at the end of the lesson. You just say, what are the 2 things you remember from this lesson? But they also looked at research and they said that if you actually do it the next day, that actually has a lot more benefit and that aligns with spaced learning for sure. So what happens is right after, students are probably like done with the lesson, they're tired, or I don't know, there's a variety of reasons, but they've seen in research that when they ask them with a little bit of a gap, and it's a simple activity called Two Things. It's a similar idea of brain dump as well, like whatever you remember about cognitive load theory, type in the chat, for example, right? So you would do that in a class and say, just share 2 things that you remember, but doing it a day later or before the next session is about to start, that actually research shows that consolidates it better. And so something so simple as a verbal thing and nobody feels pressured. And what it becomes is that you could write them down, you could just reiterate it, and it becomes again this public knowledge that goes back to everyone again, and you start from that point on. So I'll share that article if I can quickly find it. It's called Two Things. It's so simple and so awesome. But yeah, that was I hope you find that useful, Anna Marie.
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Devin, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I asked a question earlier in the chat about, I guess, prior knowledge. Would that be the same for math with having those foundational skills when you're learning, like, yeah, when kids are, trying to do new learning or what have you?
Yeah, I think it's probably more true for math than just about anything in some ways because math builds on itself so much, doesn't it? I mean, and so if the students don't have the foundational skills, then then they get lost. So if they don't learn their fractions in grade 5 or 6, and then now they're looking in grade 8 at simple algebra using pre-algebra using fractions, they're going to be suffering there. And so, I think it's really critical.
Thank you.
Is there anywhere to look for guidance on, like, I found Oswald's, the 4 different types of organizers for the advancement. Is there any guidance on how to create? Because, he talks about them being deeper and more progressive and so on. And so figuring out how to create that for topics could be challenging. And is there somewhere to look for guidance on creating those?
Nidhi, do you have any thoughts?
I don't have any immediate thoughts, but I'm thinking, I have seen, in all these teacher groups that I'm part of, there's all these things. So I've recently found one that I gave it to my daughter, which was about when she finishes a piece of writing, if she goes through that advanced organizer, then her punctuation will be better, and then she's paid attention. So it was really nicely organized. I forget what it was called. She probably remembers it. And there was another one where it was called Raise. It's like restate. So it was working with the writing piece. I don't know if there is any particular guidance to develop some, but if I come across any literature, we'll definitely share. One of the places I would recommend to look for is, like, I think a lot of the teachers are working on developing things that work really nicely with their classes. And if it's organized in a way based on the needs of the students, and then that could work really well, and you can try that. What I do when I come across a new organizer that someone else has created, because it takes time to create them as well, right? It takes a lot of time, and sometimes we know that that's a huge constraint for us all. So I do believe not reinventing the wheel, but what I do try to do now, what I know about science and learning, is that I put the lens of that on it and see, oh yeah, this actually will be beneficial. So I print it and put it in my daughter's room, for example, but not sure. Maybe Anna Marie, are you gonna say something about this point?
Yeah, I'm wondering, to Jim's point with Google, would ChatGPT be a place to start, where you just throw that in there, see what comes up, and then, of course, evaluate it. But I mean, I'm tending to go there. Yeah,
And I think that's not a bad place.
it's the new Google, the new Wikipedia, the new, right?
I agree.
So
I agree. Yeah, that's not a bad place to get the thinking going, and then you can, customize it based on your needs. And I've tried saying to ChatGPT, you were wrong, and it doesn't really feel bad. So
place to start the conversation with yourself.
Speaking of the 2 things that I mentioned earlier, not the article 2 things, I found the link and I'm sharing that in the chat with folks. It's very simple, but it's very powerful. And I shared with my daughter's teacher the other day, and it really aligned with him as well. And he said, oh, I'm definitely going to try doing this for the new lesson. And as I said, the research highly indicates that doing it with a little bit of a gap shows a lot more benefit. So thanks for that idea, Anna Marie. Yeah, ChatGPT, you could try that, Kate. But teacher groups is a good place, I feel. That's where I found that punctuation.
Yeah,
one.
you can find lots of organizers. It was more I was interested in, because he was being very specific about it being, the subsumption theory and I wanted to know if there was more had been done on his work in terms of creating those organizers. Because there's tons of graphic organizers and advanced, out there. It's more sort of specific to his work.
Actually, you've just reminded me. Yes, a colleague of ours has written a book on it. I'm going to find the name and I'm going to share that with MJ, and then we'll send it off to everyone. It's a very recent book. The book is just called Oswald in Action or something like that. And I cannot remember the name of my colleague right now. Well, it's a colleague because it's a LinkedIn connection, but other names are coming to my mind because I'm seeing so many names, but I'm going to absolutely share that with you all for sure. Yeah. It'll come. Too many names, yes. It's something on the lines of Oswald in Action or something. It's a good one. So are there any more thoughts or questions? Anusto, you have a question? Oh, you're muted.
I thought I really like this session. It's got me so much to think about.
Thank you.
I think the advanced organizers is a very practical thing. If you could also share some of these links, I'm trying to save them, but if you could
Yes,
Just
so
send some
MJ,
of
that
those
I'll send them
data.
all to you. If you can send them to everyone in the package that you put together about session 2, and then I'll put the name of the book and the link of the book as well. That would be useful for folks. And again, we don't mean to overwhelm others. Sarah Cottingham is correct. Thank you. That is correct, Megan. Thank you. I kept saying Kate because I'm talking to Kate right now. And I was like, was it Kate? So Kate Jones is another person that I read a lot of her work too. And she's written on evidence-informed instruction practice, ritual practice. So the two names are really, Sarah Cottingham is the right name. Yes, thank you. Whew, I feel better. Yes. But yeah, we'll share all those links and names with you, Anista, for sure. Awesome. And I think she's done some podcasts and stuff like that about her book as well. So you'll get it all. Yeah, perfect. Thanks. Thank you so much, Paula. Really appreciate it. Thanks, everybody. If there's no more questions, just want to make sure that Jim and I are very grateful that you take the time on this Saturday morning to hang out with us and talk science and learning. We love it. So thank you.